Welcome to Close Listening. I'm Zach Morgenstern, joined as always by silent co-host Ludwig von B. There must be some way out of here, said the joker to the thief. There's too much confusion. I can't get no relief. Iconic lines. Very Dylan, yet perhaps you had to be told that All Along the Watchtower was a Bob Dylan song because Jimi Hendrix recorded such a great cover of it. It also might stand out to you that even though it is a mysterious, poetic lyric, it's not filled to the brim with words like other Bob Dylan songs. That's because the album All Along the Watchtower came from John Wesley Harding is like nothing else in the Bob Dylan catalog, at least this far as I've been revisiting the albums from the very beginning. A line that stands out to me on All Along the Watchtower is, "Businessmen, they drink my wine." I read this as maybe saying, the record companies like my value. Businessmen, they drink my wine. Plowmen dig my earth. The toiled masses look for hope in the substance of my lyrics. Businessmen, they drink my wine. Plowmen dig my earth. None of them along the lines know what any of it is worth. But none of them really get me. So with this album, John Wesley Harding, I'm putting out the most Bob Dylan of the Bob Dylans to date. So what characterizes All Along the Watchtower, which is track 4 on this record, as a song? Well, like a number of songs on this record, it doesn't have a chorus. What it uses is a harmonica solo instead. And how Bob Dylan is that, given he's one of the most iconic of the popular harmonica players? It's also interesting in that the song seems to tell a story, but cuts off suddenly with the wind howling. You know, it's a story that's kind of confusing and builds up to its climax that's not quite complete. That's because Bob Dylan came up with these great images that are almost a story, and he didn't have to force it into something. He just gave you the beautiful vision that was in his mind. We see that in the iconic track All Along the Watchtower, but we also see that in a number of tracks on this record, including the title song, John Wesley Harding. So similarly, it makes use of harmonica solos instead of choruses, and it's a song that seems to tell a story, but kind of ends suddenly with the line, "He was never known to make a foolish move." In an interview with Cameron Crowe in 1985, Bob Dylan said he didn't know what to make of the song John Wesley Harding, so he figured the best thing to do would be to put out the album as quickly as possible, call it John Wesley Harding, because that was the one song he had no idea what it was about or why it was even on the album, and he figured he'd call the album that. So again, Bob Dylan was embracing something that was meaningful to him, even if he couldn't quite explain its meaning to the world. And what is the song John Wesley Harding, other than a catchy folk tune and a surprisingly underrated, underplayed part of the Bob Dylan catalog? Well, it's a song named for a historical figure, but the actual song here is not really about John Wesley Harding, the guy who got in trouble with the law for shooting people and was, I believe, a Confederate sympathizer. No, Bob Dylan wanted to write about an iconic cowboy outlaw type and just pick the name that had the right amount of syllables and sort of made John Wesley Harding who he needed him to be for the purpose of this song. Bob Dylan liked the imagery of cowboys and outlaws, and even if the history doesn't quite fit that idealized imagery, he didn't care. He was going to tell his version of the story. Earlier in my journey of reviewing these Bob Dylan albums, I commented that I found it funny in the liner notes for the Freewheelin' Bob Dylan. It described Bob Dylan as very authentic, because at the time, you know, Bob Dylan, both in terms of how he sang and in terms of forcing himself more than he was really inclined to do to sing about political subject matter, was kind of pretending to be Woody Guthrie. He was also pretending in that he made up all these parts of his biography about how he'd had this rambling childhood moving all around America. John Wesley Harding, by contrast, strikes me as Bob Dylan finally being authentic. For one, his voice just sounds like his voice. It doesn't have any sort of affect on it. And it may not be a Freddie Mercury voice, but, you know, as far as Bob Dylan goes, this is some pretty good singing. So that's one more thing to enjoy the record. So I've talked a lot about 2 tracks. Let's talk about some of the other ones on here. Track number 2 is called As I Went Out One Morning. This song again opens with a beautiful little harmonica solo, and it name drops Thomas Paine. It seems like the consensus of what this song is about is Bob Dylan winning the National Emergency Civil Liberties Committee Thomas Paine Award, and getting in trouble for giving a speech where he expressed his sympathy for radical communist elements of the civil rights movement, as well as sympathy for Lee Harvey Oswald, I guess. generously interpreting Lee Harvey Oswald's motives as left-wing rather than right-wing or wacky or whatever. Within the actual song, as I went out one morning, after talking metaphorically about Thomas Paine in the first verse, Dylan in the third verse said he's saved by the actual Thomas Paine. So this could be a commentary about how America's founding fathers are often invoked by people who don't understand or water down their politics, namely American conservatives who don't understand how radical the founding fathers were in their own time. And this is particularly true of Thomas Paine, who was not problematic in the way other founding fathers were. He was like a genuinely left-wing political figure. It's a sort of beautiful, crisp song. You don't really notice the sort of deeper meaning unless you look into it. It just sounds like a slightly haunting yet beautiful song about a walk out in the morning air. Track number 3 is called I Dreamed I Saw St. Augustine. And like John has Wesley Harding and As I Went Out One Morning, we again see a song talking about a historical figure's true personality can kind of be lost to time. So I can't comment on the theological details of who St. Augustine was, other than apparently the first champion of the concept of original sin. But it seems just broadly in the song, Bob Dylan is relating to the idea of a misunderstood historical figure. St. Augustine was a Catholic saint who happened to be loved by Martin Luther. So no doubt there are competing ideas of who St. Augustine was, and maybe St. Augustine was none of them. On top of that, the first line of this song quotes an old Union protest song, I Dreamed I Saw Joe Hill, about a Union activist who was killed for a murder that he, in all likelihood, didn't commit. And I feel like what Bob Dylan is doing here is he's paying tribute to the old Bob Dylan who used to engage directly with left-wing politics. And here he's saying, look, a little bit of me is interested in that, but I would prefer to be a bit more abstract, more spiritual, more philosophical, and not engage with politics in the most directly ideological or engaging with the issues kind of way. Track number 4, we've already talked about, is All Along the Watchtower. Track number 5 is Frankie Lee and Judas Priest. So a lot of the listeners hear the song as a song about a betrayal of an impressionable young man, Frankie Lee, by the manipulative Judas Priest, and then Frankie Lee ends up dying in a brothel. There are certainly moments in the song where Judas Priest comes across as a hypnotic trickster, and obviously the character's name is Judas. But the meaning that's more compelling to me is not that there's a good guy and a bad guy, but it's rather two unstable people in a relationship kind of playing off each other. The song opens with Frankie Lee and Judas Priest. They were the best of friends. It's not like Frankie Lee just runs into some trickster one day. Like there's a real relationship here. So to me, it sounds more like, I don't know, figures in the music business, each of whom get involved in their different wacky drugs and have different unstable lifestyles. And they keep on going back and forth on whether to trust each other or not. And eventually one is the death of the other. Track number 6 is called The Drifter's Escape. This kind of serves as an all-purpose protest song that focuses more on feelings than any given political issue. What stands out here is the legal authorities described in the song seem incapable of doing the right thing. "Oh, stop that cursed jury," cried the attendant and the nurse. "The trial was bad enough, but this is 10 times worse." Track 7 is Dear Landlord. This kind of works as an anti-landlord protest song because it's about one person having too much power over the singer. This one stands out musically as well because it's soulfully performed on piano, reminiscent of the song Ballad of a Thin Man from Highway 61 Revisited. If one looks at the nuances of the lyrics, it's not necessarily an anti-landlord protest song, and many have heard it as being really about Bob Dylan's manager, Albert Grossman. But, you can get something out of it, even if you don't know the historical details. Track number 8 is called I Am a Lonesome Hobo. This is one I found where when I listened to the song, I had a very different experience from when I looked at the lyrics. Listening to the sympathetic tones that Bob Dylan puts into the hobo's voice, the parts he emphasizes, it sounds like it really is a song about someone living on the street or out on the road, telling other people to be grateful and not make the same mistakes he did. Whereas when one looks at the lyrics without the context of Bob Dylan's tone, it looks like it's more critical of its singer and maybe not about a homeless person at all. It sounds like it's a cynical song about celebrity, perhaps, someone being spiritually poor and that he doesn't have solid relationships of trust. Track number 9 is called I Pity the Poor Immigrant. So I feel like we've had a quartet of songs here from The Drifter's Escape, Dear Landlord, I'm a Lonesome Hobo, I Pity the Poor Immigrant, studies of different impoverished, marginalized people. And it's debatable if all or any of those songs are literal in their subject matter. And again, with I Pity the Poor Immigrant, if one looks at the lyrics, one can certainly feel it's not a sort of migrant rights song as much as it is about the notion of lost souls out in the world. Track number 10 is called The Wicked Messenger. And this one certainly feels like it's religiously or biblically influenced. It's kind of castigating the old Bob Dylan as a singer. It says, for his tongue, it could not speak, but only flatter. So on his previous few albums, Dylan's lyrics were getting very long and abstract. And I think he was well aware that he was kind of showing off, and not all of those songs can be special and have meaning. There's only so much showing off you can do before you reverse himself. So he's celebrating that with this album, he's managed to be more succinct and hopefully more open to the listener. And then we get to the final 2 songs, which are comparatively lighter fare. So Down Along the Cove, this one uses piano again, and it has a bit of an upbeat sound to it. So certainly compared to the other Bob Dylan songs, it sounds like a sort of happy on the beach song. And then finally, the album ends with a country song called I'll Be Your Baby Tonight, which was kind of foreshadowing the music Dylan would do on his next album, Nashville Skyline. Has slightly quirky lyrics, but mostly just a fairly solid, catchy country tune. So overall, a lot of good material on this one. My dad showed it to me when I was 11 years old and teaching myself to play the harmonica, and it was fun to play along with it. This album strips out all the instrumental sounds from the last few albums, but doesn't go pure folk. You still have some drums and bass, and occasionally other sounds like slide guitar and I'll Be Your Baby Tonight. But it's a nice balance between big band Dylan and folky Dylan. And even though I think lots of these songs are critically acclaimed, it stands out, I would think, as one of the more underrated Bob Dylan albums. And I don't know if that's even because the album art is kind of understated. It's very cool, but like the gray frame to it maybe means it's not a pretty album to show, on posters of cool albums of the 1960s. So this may very well may be one that you haven't heard before. It doesn't have the classic protest songs, and it doesn't have the big songs of a Blonde on Blonde, but it absolutely has its place in a Dylan's fan's heart. So check it out. I'm Zach Morgenstern. This is Ludwig von B. See you next time.